Good morning, guys. I want to speak about I think, third topic I was going to cover before we get to algorithm intros on AI. And that's one that's actually close to my heart because I think for 20 plus years of my career, I've spent in some way or another in the arena of marketing research, either literally interviewing customers, knocking on doors, which is not the most pleasant things you can try and do, doing telephone interviews, which is sort of equally unpleasant. I then, even for a while, did telephone interviews on political canvassing, which is infinitely worse than all of these. But what is the intent of research? Let's start there. The intent of research is to try and replicate the gaps, the opportunities, the responses that the marketplace may have to things that we want to introduce, to new product concepts, to advertising campaigns, to usage and attitudes about brands, to usage patterns, and a whole host of other factors, some of them more tangible, like, for instance, your out of stock scenario in supermarket groups. Others a lot less tangible, and those are the determinants of usage. As much of the determinants will lie outside of the current perceptual base of customers. They will make certain decisions intuitively, and I saw it with my own eyes where people would buy what they believe is a certain thing, and you stop them at the supermarket exit, and what they bought brand-wise is an entirely different brand. And that was what we then called a generic issue. In other words, they associate all Colgate, all toothpaste with Colgate. I also ran a research department for many years, which incidentally was in my early career, which helped me, understand coding, the words people use, often the lack of technical language that we would use in research. Now, let us remember, research is done for a simple reason, and that is to reduce uncertainty in decision making. That's the only real reason why we do research. Whether it's COVID research to try and ascertain, normally on very, very small samples, the way that people will react to certain combinations of medication formulations, and hence why that's often criticized, and why a lot of people didn't want to use the COVID vaccines that were created. But the harsh reality is most medicines used today were equally created through small samples. So the reality is, it is to reduce uncertainty in decision making. Now, let's go back to the research I was involved in, and I cannot give you an exception to that rule after, as I say, 20 years of being involved in research, either as a research manager, managing research processes, drafting questionnaires, making sure that the questionnaires logically make sense. If you look at things like SurveyMonkey, a lot of it simply does not make sense. Sorry, SurveyMonkey. And they're far too lengthy. Normal human beings won't complete those questionnaires comprehensively unless you've got nothing else to do. But the reality is, it's about reduction of uncertainty in decision making. Now, when we talk about that, the one element I spoke about is, how do you teach by deduction? And how do you know that certain things are there but you can't see them? Because in AI, that is a very critical component of research, and the way in which we try and explain variation and variability in data. Now, I'm going to give you one or two examples. If you take certain things like the observation of the size of the universe, where we have to rely on indirect data like how fast light travels, whether it's the discovery of black holes. A lot of it is based on cause and effect. In other words, we deduce certain things on the basis of other things. So we cannot directly necessarily measure it because it's not measurable by any standard of measure we have. It may one day be, but right now it's not. So by deduction, we learn certain things. Now, I can tell you, if you look at product research, very rarely do you find that one product wins 70% over 30%. Often they're more or less in the same gambit, which means that often those decisions are still made somewhat subjectively because there is not a full answer to the reason why one product formulation is preferred over another. In some instances, it's pretty clear. In other instances, it is not clear. In other words, often we have to make decisions based on a deduction of data that doesn't exist. Do we know what that data is? No, because if we did know, we could include it in artificial intelligence, and it would also form part of our own human intelligence. Now, if you take multivariate analysis, things like conjoint, a lot of those kinds of componentry that are more of a subjective nature and therefore an emotional nature, which often describes the vast majority of purchasing, will not be included in those equations. And even if they are, they will probably be estimates from the consumer side. And the average consumer, in a way, has this tendency to appear logical, not emotional. So there you have that kind of problem. When you do group discussions, you invariably have things like groupthink, where if I say something, it becomes incrementally more difficult for some of the other participants to disagree with me. Of course, you have wild cards, and sometimes I introduced wild cards deliberately into group discussions to ensure that the wild card discussion at least takes place. Doesn't mean that it gives you 100% answer, but it helps. Then when you look at very much more sophisticated multivariate analysis, and you will find that in many instances, in things like segmentation and perceptual analyses of brands, you will find that it may at best explain 60, 70, maybe sometimes 75% of the variance in the data. Now, what do I mean by that? It means that if you look at the way the data is spread on, say, a spreadsheet, it will only account for X amount of variance based upon that particular product category. So if it's about why I use this bank versus that bank, it's fairly easy to see the bias in terms of the profile of users. But the 20% that is not included will be the 20% that I cannot include because neither did I think about it, nor is it there at all. In other words, there is a variance that's excluded, and that's again a variable and an element that's not part of the equation, and therefore not part of the discussion, and therefore not part of the explanation. Now that makes it even more complex because now I've got to start guesstimating what that could possibly be. And in many instances, that will either be questions I did not ask, many times it's that, or secondly, it'll be because those factors are emotional or based on other areas that I cannot quantify at that point. In other words, at best, I will represent, say, 70% of the variance in the market, which is not bad. But there are also instances where I only explain 45% of the variance or 40%, which means that almost half of decisions about why people choose one brand over another is not explained at all by the research that I have. So what I'm trying to say to you, if the data in AI is not included, it is not included. And often he starts with intelligence because I may not know what data to include. The second thing is I may not know how to phrase that data. In the third instance, consumers may not want to respond to that data. In the fourth instance, like with status, consumers feel a little bit self-conscious, so they're not going to acknowledge that when they buy a Gucci bag, there's an element of status involved. So you've got various factors that start with intelligence. That means they are not included in the reduction of uncertainty in decision-making when I look at marketing research. Now, this is a very, very real issue for AI. Because at this point, as I said in my very first talk on this topic, the vast majority of things we don't know. We know a fraction of what happens in the world. The vast majority we don't know, either because it's in the sea or undetectable, either because it's in the universe and hence only by deduction. Thirdly, because people don't want to answer that question. Fourthly, because many researchers didn't even think of the question to ask. And that becomes pretty problematical. It also is even more problematical when we look at segmentation research, because hardly any segmentation research will have segments that are entirely mutually exclusive. They always overlap with certain other segments. Now, that again adds another layer of complexity. So what I'm trying to say is, in the deduction of answers to reduce uncertainty, the very same principles that apply to research will apply to AI. Exactly the same principles. You have to have the data. You have to have the comprehensive data. Now, I can tell you, I do not believe that is ever entirely possible. But then, if we can, at least with AI, reduce the uncertainty, similar to what we do in research, it gives us greater certainty that a decision is correct. It doesn't give us 100% certainty, but it does give us a greater certainty that we are correct. Thank you, guys. We will carry on tomorrow with another sequence of AI, and now I want to become pretty practical and start talking about the actual applications in commercial terms. I just wanted to give you the intro to try and explain that we must not believe AI will solve all the problems of the world, because that'll be pretty hard to do. Cheers, guys. Have a good day. Bye.